Hello and welcome back to my channel. I am Mercedes and this is the Frugal Life with Mercedes. So we have several things to talk about. So first and foremost, last night, Monday night, the Senate voted on passing a bill to help end the government shutdown. And they said that it was a bipartisan plan. And 8 Democrat senators sided with the Republicans, and basically how it's being put in the news and in articles was that a breakaway group of 8 Democrats in the Senate struck up a deal with the Republicans so that this would pass. And immediately those 8 senators got a lot of backlash from their political party, but it passed. So today is Tuesday and tomorrow, Wednesday, the Congress are supposed to vote on this bill as well. And so we will see how that all works out. But I do want to remind you guys that if this passes and the government does reopen, contrary to popular belief and what is being said, the government won't instantly reopen. It could take several days for it to reopen, depending upon what's going on and what kind of deals were struck. So it could still be a couple of days, like even if it's tomorrow and it does pass, which we don't know if it will pass or not. So there's a lot of like ins and outs. Another thing, so I've been talking about the SNAP benefits, and 2 judges said that the Trump administration needed to fund SNAP, and then it was taken over to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled, one judge of the Supreme Court ruled that basically that doesn't have to be upheld because there are several lawsuits regarding SNAP benefits, and whether or not the government legally has to pay them or pay all of them or part of them, if states can distribute funds of their own to pay. It's like a huge mess because, as I've said in a couple other videos, there were several states that said, hey, we're going to use our own state money to pay SNAP benefits or partial SNAP benefits to the people living in our state that receive SNAP benefits. And then the federal government were like, yo, you can't do that. And then the states are like, yeah, we can. It's our money. And the federal government's like, no, you can't. And so that's like a whole big mess. And they wanted them to undo the full or partial SNAP benefits paid out by the states, which they were already paid. You know what I mean? They were already paid. So there's not really anything you can do about that. I'm not really sure, I haven't seen a lot about that, like, since it was said. And that's because there's so many things going on and there's so many updates. It's really hard to keep it all straight because it was like, well, you guys better undo that. But of course that was said like almost a week after they were starting to distribute them. And it's like, well, you can't open Pandora's box and then a week later shove it back in. So I'm not really sure how that's all gonna like pan out, but apparently there's a lot of lawsuits and appeals and all sorts of things. But essentially the Supreme Court justice said that she is going to block the legislation put down by the lower courts for the time being. So blocking the lower level courts told the Trump administration they must immediately pay SNAP benefits. Then it was taken to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is like, hey, let's not do that because the government's going to be reopened in a couple of days. So essentially, it's not really about whether the federal government can or can't, or legally can or legally can't, or should or shouldn't pay SNAP benefits. It's okay, well, whether they can, or they should, or they could, or they would, don't worry about that because the government's going to be open in a couple of days. That's at least my interpretation of what the articles that I've read was they're not really getting into the legalities of whether the federal government should have stopped paying them or legally shouldn't have paid them or legally should have paid them. It was more like the federal government's going to be open again, so like let's not even like dabble into this. But I do want to remind you that 42 million Americans rely on SNAP benefits. So to those 42 million Americans, it does matter, because if we're in a position like this again, it sets a precedent. I'm always talking to people about precedents. If I go and do XYZ and I'm not held accountable, or I'm never called out for that, then you're going to think it's okay. And this person's going to think it's okay. And so that's why it's really important for the government to say, this is what we have to do. This is what the law is, and everybody must follow it. So when you have courts saying like, now granted, they didn't say it doesn't matter, but if you read between the lines, it's like, hey, don't worry about that because the government's going to be open. Okay, but can a president withhold SNAP benefits? Can Senate and Congress withhold SNAP benefits? Is it legal to do so? And the answer is yes or no, based off laws. And I don't have those answers. I'm not a lawyer. I can only base it off my knowledge. And so that's why it's really important that when it goes through the courts, like they need to say, this is what the law says, this is what you have to do, or this is what the law says and don't do this. So it's really just passing the buck and not really addressing the real issue of, can you withhold this legally? So I'm really hoping that they don't just like, when this is all said and done, that they just never go back and address it. But because of the way that our politics work, they probably never will unless it comes up again. And then I can see making videos about this years from now, potentially when we're in another government shutdown. It's like, oh, well, during that shutdown, XYZ happened. And it's like, yes, but is it legal or is it not legal? And it helps set up a standard of what we're supposed to do. So again, I don't have the answers of whether it is legal or not legal. I don't agree with the way that any of this has been handled. I don't agree with any way that the shutdown's been handled, or SNAP benefits has been handled, or the air traffic controller situation's been handled. And that's on all sides. Everybody's acting like a hot mess. So we're going to see what happens with that. So for now, we have it passed in the Senate. It's now got to pass in Congress. Possibly there's going to be some rogue Democrat congressman. I don't know. And then as far as SNAP benefits, that is being blocked right now. That lower courts ruling that the benefits need to be paid in full, because there is a hope and a prayer that the government is going to open again in the next couple of days. But today is November 11th, so that's 11 days of people not getting their SNAP benefits. And I'm going to do a video eventually when this is all calmed down. I've made it perfectly clear how I feel about SNAP benefits, but there's a lot of misconceptions about SNAP benefits. And the one thing I really am going to say is, which I'm pretty sure I've said this in other videos, but in case you haven't seen those, there is a protocol for how you get these assisted programs, whether it's, Section 8 housing or SNAP benefits or WIC or child care assistance. There is a list of rules, regulations, and standards. So if I go to receive one of these, or a government subsidy of some sort, and I meet all the criteria, and I present all the proper documentation, then I get that housing assistance or the SNAP benefits or the child care assistance. So there has to be some sort of understanding of that. Are there people that take advantage of the system? Yes, but the vast majority do not. So if you have an issue with all these people taking advantage, well, then your issue really is the system that's in place, less than the people. Because Most people, if they found out that they could get SNAP benefits or, you know, electricity assistance or childcare assistance, and because they meet the criteria, most people would use that service. So if you meet the criteria and you turn in all your proper documentation, are you really taking advantage? Or is the system broken? Is the regulations not stringent enough? Are the rules not clear enough? Is one state being more lenient and one state being more strict? I don't know, but I am going to get into that in a whole nother video. But just kind of some things to think about. And another thing I want to point out, this bill that's being passed right now, or in the process of being passed, would only fund the government until the end of January 2026. So that would only be a couple of months, and then we could potentially be in this situation again. Because back in March of 2025, so earlier this spring, there was almost a government shutdown, but essentially they came to a conclusion where they're like, hey, let's put a pin in this and we'll deal with it later. And then there were never really any real negotiations. There was never any real hard, okay, let's get together. And I'm not saying nobody. I'm just saying obviously, because we've been in a government shutdown for over 40 days. So they had from March until October 1st, and they didn't come up with any sort of conclusions or solutions. And so what's the likelihood that they're going to come up with a permanent solution by the end of January? I don't think so. And that's something I have a real issue with the government. And I always think about this from a relationship standpoint. I learned in therapy that you and a significant other continually have the same disagreements, the same, issues. And if every time you have that conversation or that disagreement, you're putting a pin in it. Oh, we'll deal with it next time. Okay, well, I love you. Let's move on with our day. And then it keeps coming up. You're going to have that problem as long as you're in that relationship, because you have to come to some sort of understanding. And it's the same thing with the government. They just keep pushing things aside and And there are things that have never properly been figured out, regulated, resolved for decades. It's like a super dysfunctional marriage. Do you know what I mean? And it's like, girl, y'all got to go to couples counseling or break up, And I feel like that's what our federal government is doing. It's all pretending. And, they do come at each other, all sides come at each other, and it's kind of drama and stuff. But it's but they never really come up with real solutions. And they just keep sweeping crap under the rug. And I think that we really need to see a change where it's here's an issue, here's a solution, that's law. And then you move on to the next problem. You can't just keep sweeping stuff under the rug. So anyway, that's what's currently going on right now, but that could change right after I post this video. But anyway, guys, I hope that you got something out of this video. Please consider subscribing to my channel, and until next time, guys, bye.